Hi there, I'm John Glynn. What I'm going to do today with my looking at the camera is to look at a sort of function button at the back of your cameras, which a lot of people have asked me about, and that is, what is this AE and AF lock, and when would we use that? Okay, it's a strange looking little button, usually found on the back, sometimes it's on the top, but for most cameras it's on the back. Okay. AE lock, exposure lock. AF lock is the autofocus lock. Generally speaking, when we take pictures, we press the shutter button down on the camera at the top here to take a picture, and when we do that we also lock focus at the same time. So as long as you keep that button held down, it will be sharp, so you move your camera left and right once you've focused on your subject, and it will remain in focus until you press the shutter button, and then you may have to realign it again. Some people prefer to, instead of that button actually doing the focusing, they prefer a button on the back of the camera to do the focusing and become the AF lock here. So you point your camera at your subject as you would normally, but instead of pressing that button to focus, you press that button to focus, you lock the focus, and that button on the top is purely for taking the picture. The other factor this will do is lock the exposure information, the shutter speed and apertures, when you take a picture, and that is particularly in the case of when you're using the camera in program mode, aperture value mode, shutter priority mode. Okay. The trouble with these modes is that when we point the camera at our subject and half press the shutter button, we're locking focus. But if I then move my camera off my subject, it's no longer holding the exposure information, it's holding the focus because I've pressed that shutter button down. But if I move my camera so that now my subject is no longer in the middle of the frame, but is actually at the side of the frame, it's now reading light elsewhere in the picture area, and in the process of reading light elsewhere in the picture, it could render the subject, the person that I'm focused on, either too light or too dark, because the camera is now reading the background. So when I'm taking a picture in program mode, aperture value mode and shutter priority mode, if I want to ensure that the reading on the subject stays the same, so when I point my camera at my subject and I move my camera left or right after having pressed the shutter button for focusing, I want to keep the exposure information on that subject the same as it is when I point my camera there, I have to hold the AE lock button in as well. So I point the camera at my subject, I half press the shutter button, it focuses on the subject, I then at the same time press the button on the back. That locks the shutter speed and the aperture information and the ISO information, so that when I then press the AE lock button in and the shutter button and I move my camera around, the exposure time and the exposure aperture and the ISO remain fixed on whatever it was reading at the time I pressed the focusing. Now of course I'm having to do two things at once here. I'm having to hold down both the top button and the back button at the same time, move my camera and then take a picture. And some people find that awkward and time consuming, and then you're resetting it. So it may be easier just to transfer all the data of this from your menu. If you go into your menu settings, there'll be a way of resetting this button to do focusing and or exposure locking as well. And this is useful if you're into street photography and you're pointing your camera at your subject. You press the button to lock focus and exposure information on your subject. You can now move your camera left and right or slightly off so that you can recompose and take your photograph when you're ready. But because you've got your finger locked on the back, you can continue taking pictures because the information is still locked. So you don't have to recompose, you just keep on taking pictures, and whatever you had focused on and whatever you had locked your exposure information on will remain locked in position picture after picture after picture. Okay, so by pressing that button in, I can just keep on taking pictures and it will remain with the same information the whole time. Nothing changes. Okay, so it may be worth looking at that as an option, particularly if you're doing street photography. So there are some street photographers who swear blind that what you should do is have what they call back focusing, which is what this is. It's a back focus button. Effectively, it's a button at the back of your camera that does the focusing, and turn the option on the top off for focusing, but also have it so that it also locks the exposure information as well. Okay, the focusing will work in manual mode, but the exposure information doesn't need to be locked if you're using manual mode, because in manual mode, whatever you put your shutter speed, aperture and ISO to remains there until you change it anyway. So therefore, you don't need to lock the exposure information when it comes to doing manual mode. It's only in the program mode, aperture value mode and the shutter priority mode that you need to lock the exposure information, but focusing would still be using the back button for back focus. Again, for the same reason that you point this camera at your subject, press the shutter button, not the back button, the back focus button down on your subject. They remain sharp, so that when you then move your camera left and right and recompose and keep taking pictures, as long as you're keeping your thumb down on this back button, then it will be your subject will remain sharp throughout your picture taking. Okay, so it's just understanding the purpose for it, and it does very much depend, I think, on the sort of photography you're going to be doing as to whether it's worth going down that route or whether you're just happy leaving it with the top button here as your focus lock. The drawback with the top button is you point at your subject, you hard press the shutter button to lock the focus and take a picture, let go, and now you have to start all over again, refocusing on your subject, lock down the shutter button, half turn the camera again to recompose and take your photograph. So it's a little bit more awkward in that way, particularly if you're working fast in street photography. Okay, all of this is very, very personal, and there's no real right way or wrong way. I tend to use manual focusing, so that if I'm doing street photography, I manually focus, so I don't need to do a focus lock for that because I'm manually focusing, but the AE lock does come in useful if you're pointing the camera at your subject and you're in shutter priority mode or in aperture value mode, and you're then going to say, right, that's the exposure I need, lock it, and I can move my camera and keep taking the pictures knowing that the exposure isn't going to change. Okay, hopefully that makes some kind of sense, and the main thing is to practice and get a feel for your camera, take lots of pictures and see how you get on. Okay, thanks for watching. Bye.